Okay, last up we have results and interpretation for speech testing. So we know that for the SRT, it's serving as a cross-check for PTA. It should be within 6 dB of PTA. SRT values that are within 0 to 6 dB of PTA are considered to have good agreement. If they're within 7 to 12 dB, they have fair agreement, and if they're more than 12 dB apart, they're in very poor agreement. And really you need to look at sort of your circumstances in the audiogram, but by and large they should be within 6 dB or at the very least close to it. So it may be if you're using recorded speech and you can't familiarize with every single spondee word, you end up at a 7 dB or, an 8 dB agreement potentially. But you sort of have a reason for that. I put the malingering hashtag here. A big SRT PTA difference is a red flag for somebody that is not being completely honest about what their hearing may be. Particularly if the SRT is better than the PTA. It's much, much, much more difficult to judge the loudness of speech. So, sometimes people can do a good job at faking a hearing loss with pure tones, but when it comes to listening to speech, they don't have good judgment in terms of what is loud and what's actually not that loud. If you're looking at the SAT or the SDT, you basically just want to know, is it consistent with the thresholds on the audiogram? Does it line up? Based on the audiogram, would you expect that the patient can simply detect speech at the value you found? The SAT or SDT is always going to be lower than the SRT. And that makes sense because you can know that somebody's talking even if you can't hear clearly enough to make out what they're saying. So typically the SAT or SDT is going to be anywhere from 5 to 15 dB lower than the SRT. And then for word recognition, again, your interpretation is going to be based on what your goal is. If your goal is PB max, to get the best performance possible in quiet, then you can categorize scores according to these. I've actually now stumbled across several different of these classifications, and I've also had a couple of audiologists tell me that they are moving away from these classification scales, but you're still probably going to see on audiograms, word recognition was excellent and then a percentage in parentheses, or, word rec was good in one ear and fair in the other ear. What's most important is that you put the actual word recognition score there in parentheses so that other people reading the report would have it to refer to. It's really important, again, to interpret the word rec results based on context and what you're trying to do. Doing word recognition at a conversational volume can be a really effective counseling tool to say, hey, even in the best possible listening circumstances, when someone's talking at a normal conversational volume, you're missing 30% of what's being said. Same thing with word rec with visual cues. Especially if somebody gets a very low score in word recognition and they're sort of discouraged about it, some people can improve as much as 60% when you add visual cues in. So that can be a really effective counseling tool too, to talk about, you need to change your habits. You need to be aware of where you're seated and where the lighting is and all of those things, because visual cues are so important for you. And then you want to look at the word rec score compared to the degree of hearing loss. Does it make sense? Look at how much more intense the words are compared to where thresholds are. Do you expect that the person's going to be able to hear all of the frequencies of, consonant and vowel sounds based on their hearing loss? And how does that compare? there's actually several studies looking at, with certain degrees of hearing loss, what you would expect word recognition scores to be. And Dubno did sort of the first most landmark study on this. This is something we'll go over in class. I have the chart to show you, but it's hard to show you effectively how to use it if you can't see me drawing on the chart. And then you have the option for word recognize, which is more ecologically valid. It's going to give you more real-world day-to-day results to talk to the patient about. There's a couple of things you need to consider when interpreting word recognition scores. First, the test parameters are so important. There's so many different ways about how you can do word recognition testing that all impact the difficulty of the test or the task, and thereby also are likely to impact score or performance. Because of this, you need to document everything on your audiogram. It should not be mysterious how word recognition testing was performed. You need to document what list you used, how many words were in the list, if you used masking or no masking, if you were using recorded speech or monitored live voice, the list itself. And just as an aside, you should always document which transducer you're using if you're using inserts or headphones as well. Everything needs to be documented because that is really going to have a large effect on interpretation. Monitored live voice is typically easier to understand than recorded speech. Typically people score better when you use MLV compared to recorded speech. Some word lists are easier than others. Somebody who listens to the NU6 may have a poorer score than the same person listening to the W22 because the vocabulary for the W22 is easier. The length of the list that you give affects scores and affects what a significant difference is between the score. And this is what the Thornton and Raffin article is all about. And that's also an article you're going to people are going to refer to all the time. So essentially, if you give a 50-word list, you're more likely that the score you get is reliable. When you go down to a 25-word list or a 10-word list, there's more variability in the score, and that means that the score is not quite as reliable, and in order for you to get a different score a year later, it has to be a bigger difference. And I'll give you an example in a minute. Intensity level also affects the score. Typically things are more audible when they're higher intensity, but for some people they're going to end up with recruitment and they're not going to be able to tolerate louder lists, or they may end up with distortion at high intensity levels. Masking is also a big issue, and we haven't really talked about it yet, but if you put noise in the opposite ear, especially for elderly people, sometimes patients just can't do it. They get distracted. It's much harder for them to hear. So if masking is being used, it's also going to potentially change the word recognition score. When possible, if you're using paper lists, I always like to write what the patient is actually saying, because that can help you with interpretation too. It might be that you look down the list and you look at the errors and you go, oh, the patient's missing S's. Or you look down the list and say, you know what, the patient is missing final consonants for many of the words. Writing down the exact patient response can actually help you with interpretation and counseling. Okay, this is what I was talking about with the Thornton and Raffin list. So let's say your patient got 80% correct, and you test them with a 25-word list. And they got 80% correct one year, and then the following year you test again using a 25-word list, and you want to know, is the score significantly different? compared to your original score of 80% here in this first column. A score of 100% will be different because it's outside of this 25-word window here in the third column. And a score of 52% would be a significantly different score. But even if they went from a score of 80% to 60%, and you're only using a 25-word list, at that point that's not going to be considered a significant or critical difference in word recognition score. And that's it's essentially based on statistical principles related to variability and sample size. This is the sprint chart. This is the Dubno chart I was telling you about. Where it's comparing PTA on the left to percent correct on the top. So let's say a person had a PTA, it looks like here they have a PTA of 48%. And so if you follow this arrow, this red arrow over from the left, at 48%, so at 48%, if they had a word recognition score of 44%, you follow this arrow down from the top, and it's in the shaded range. The shaded range here is essentially showing you poorer than expected. So you can see this whole top half is shaded. Any intersection point in the shaded area is a poorer than expected score. And you should start to wonder if there's other factors. If PTA doesn't accurately represent the hearing loss, maybe they have a ski slope right after that. Maybe they have cognitive impairment or memory impairment or a speech impediment or something like that that's also playing in to affect the word recognition score. And then the second part is harder to explain. But if you find, let's say the first time you did the word recognition testing, they got a score of 44. So you follow this blue arrow up from the bottom to 44. And then the second time you did the testing, they got a 68. And you want to know, is that 68% significantly different from the 44? And this, I believe, should be based on a 50-word list. Yeah. This should be based on a 50-word list, I believe. And you can see the intersection of these two arrows here is outside of this oval, which means that there is a significant difference. Inside the oval means there's no real difference, the oval made by the arrows. Outside of the oval means it is, in fact, a significant difference between the two scores. Yes. And we'll go over this again in class. I know the sprint chart particularly is confusing because it's actually allowing you to do two things at once.